Everybody, Lance Russell and Dave Brown right along ringside. By golly, we're about ready to go with more big action.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'm Gordon Solie, your host, and we have quite an hour in store for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Championship Wrestling at ringside. This is Vince McMahon, along with wrestling's only living legend, Bruno Sammartino.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mid-South Wrestling Television. I'm your host, Boyd Pierce, another outstanding card.
Hey, guys, and welcome back to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. I am Ray Russell, and this week, a very special edition of Regional Wrestling. Going to ditch the projects for just 1 week. Going to bring on a couple of authors here in the professional wrestling world, and maybe even beyond. First, a returning guest. We've had him here before on the program discussing the history of wrestling in Chicago. He's also the author of Bruiser, the world's most dangerous wrestler. And of course, we'll be talking about his latest venture in the world of biographies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the program the one and only Mr. Richard Vicek.
Nice to be back here again, Ray, and should be fun tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to discussing this. You know, it's been a long time coming. We finally got everything aligned, all the stars aligned for this. And you didn't do this alone, though, did you?
No, I found a writer from the state of Washington, Steve Verrier, who wrote the Gene Kiniski biography, among others. Mm-hmm. And in that biography, the name Wilbur Snyder came up a lot.
I would imagine so.
And of course, with my Dick the Bruiser biography, the name Wilbur Snyder came up frequently. And so we were talking and we thought, well, what about we put our heads together for Wilbur?
All right. And not to be outdone, Richard, we've got a co-author. He too has had some past experience writing a few professional wrestling books, some other books as well, but including, and not limited to, Professional Wrestling in the Pacific Northwest, a history from 1883 to the present. He also wrote the biography for Gene Kiniski, Big Thunder, Canadian wrestling legend, and the biography for George Gordienko, Canadian wrestler, artist, and Renaissance man. And now you guys have co-authored the latest book, Wilbur Snyder, the world's most scientific wrestler. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Regional Wrestling, Mr. Steve Verrier. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, we're glad to have you. You put out a few books in the past. Of course, Richard, we talked about yours in the past. The Dick the Bruiser book, The World's Most Dangerous Wrestler. But Steve, you put out Professional Wrestling in the Pacific Northwest, the Gene Kiniski and George Gordienko bios. So you've done a lot of work in the wrestling world, but you've also written some other books outside of the wrestling world. Maybe we'll touch on that later in the program. But right now, I think Richard kind of hit on it a little bit. But the first thing I got to ask you guys is, you don't see a lot of co-authors working together to put together a very definitive book on any biography, really. So I'm curious, was it just Richard? Did you reach out to Steve, vice versa? You saw a lot of Wilbur Snyder mentioned in both of your books, Gene Kiniski, Dick the Bruiser. How did you guys come together?
Steve wrote me or emailed me saying that there's things that he liked about the Bruiser book, and that he asked if I wanted to take a look at his Kiniski book, because Bruiser pops into the book from time to time.
Sure.
I did, and I noticed Steve's specialty area, among other things, is genealogy and family tree history.
Okay.
And I thought that would be a good thing to include in the Wilbur Snyder story. And so that's how some talk started. And then maybe Steve, I'm sure, can add to this.
Yeah, well, it seemed a natural partnership. I mean, I enjoyed reading the Bruiser book very much. Bruiser, of course, was a good friend of Kiniski, and both were very good friends of Wilbur Snyder. And Wilbur is certainly well situated geographically, and in terms of his years of watching wrestling from Indianapolis and Chicago, that it just seemed a very good opportunity. And what drives me to want to write about a wrestler is recognizing that person as more than just a wrestler. And I think Snyder fit that category. So, I got pretty excited about this project. It was the first book that I co-wrote, but since then, actually, I worked with a couple of other people on a book having nothing to do with wrestling, and obviously co-written. So, I'm enjoying that. You have to do, I wouldn't say you have to do less, but you can depend on somebody else to do more. So,
sure.
Very happy with how things turned out.
Well, I'm happy that you guys are very selfless to come together and work together. You don't see that a whole lot in the wrestling world per se. And so you guys really trusted one another to do the digging, and it really came out well.
Ray, we haven't figured out yet which of us is going to do the heel turn when the time comes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've always wanted to see a Richard heel turn, to be honest with you. That would be very intriguing. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Do you guys have anything else? And I don't want to spoil anything, but have you guys discussed about maybe doing anything else together, collaboration in the future?
We're talking, and like preliminary type stuff.
Okay, that's fair. I don't want to spoil too much there. I'm just out of curiosity. So was the Wilbur Snyder book always something in the back of your mind? Because the Chicago, Richard, I'm talking to you obviously here because you did the Dick the Bruiser book. We talked all about Chicago wrestling history. So was Wilbur Snyder always something that you thought about doing, or did it come along later?
It came along many years after the Bruiser book. And my concern was, well, Bruiser got so much of the publicity. So many of the articles and ads had Bruiser as the main event. And, of course, when you're doing wrestling of this era, you are confronted with the fact that many of the participants are no longer with us.
Yes.
In fact, there have been deaths in just in this calendar year. Bruiser enhancement talent Tom Lynch. There was a Green Bay Packer teammate that passed away recently. We lost Mike Snyder sometime this year, I believe. We don't know the exact date. Wilbur's son, who was the primary interview source for the Wilbur book. The family has kept the information private. There's been no internet, like legacy obituary, for instance. Right. Anyway, over 110 people who I interviewed or exchanged letters with from the Bruiser book have passed away.
Wow. That's insane. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I'm glad you guys got it in, when you did with the Bruiser book, and I'm glad you got in what you did with the Snyder book. While the getting was good.
Luckily, I still had interview tapes from the Bruiser book that sometime they talked about Wilbur.
Okay. So you guys basically split the book in half here with Wilbur Snyder. Steve, you did the early years, and Richard, you did the later years. Let's go back to the early years. I want to ask you, Steve, how long did the process take, would you say, in general, to kind of piece together? Because now you're talking a lot of older people involved. A lot of these people may not have been there for you to interview or discuss or get as much information on the internet world, the internet era, so to speak. So I'm curious your process and how long it took you to kind of piece everything together.
Well, I often juggle several projects, so it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly, how much time I spent, getting ready to actually undertake the writing. I grew up watching Wilbur Snyder. It wasn't until I worked on the Kiniski book that I realized, what a key fellow Wilbur was in the wrestling industry in the 1950s, especially. So when we actually started working on the book, we did consult a lot of articles pertaining to the era and the location in which Wilbur grew up. I looked at the genealogy and went back a couple of 100 years and, determined that, okay, the family was here and then they went across the country. They settled in Utah and just a lot of things, little by little. But it certainly took a number of months to get started on the actual writing. And as Richard indicated, Mike Snyder was a great source, but there were not a lot of people we could actually talk to who knew firsthand what, Wilbur had experienced when he was very, very young. But certainly several months on the genealogy, his introduction to wrestling. I try to do things as quickly and as in a concentrated manner as I can. But, you can't go too fast with that if you're going to get it right. Took a long time, but again, that knowing that I had somebody working quite ably on the second half of Wilbur's life really helped me to focus on that first half.
Certainly. He's referring to you, Richard. So I got a question for both of you guys here. And Richard, you can go first because we got Steve in the last question. But you guys have both written books in the past. You guys know how to do the deep dive and the research and to get everything together. So I'm sure over time you guys have encountered things you never knew. You thought you knew the guy, and then, wow, there's even more to the story. So I got to ask you both, and we'll start with Richard here. Was there the one thing that stuck out to you during your research that you didn't know about Wilbur Snyder that surprised you?
I did not know what a vast territory he traveled from 1954 to 1963, all over the United States. And I wrote this down for such a question.
Okay.
Mike Snyder recited all the states that he and his sister moved, Father Wilbur and Mother Shirley, in the early wrestling. They lived in California, Illinois, Texas, back to Illinois, back to California, Indiana, Minnesota, California, and back to Indiana. And of course, somewhere in there was a stint in Ontario near Buffalo, on the Canadian side of Buffalo.
Okay.
I didn't know. I mean, yeah, I've seen old wrestling magazines. I was aware of Snyder Wrestling Gagne and Bruiser and Pafo in Chicago. Mm-hmm. I had no idea how over he was, and for all over the country he worked.
Yeah. Well, you're looking at the Midwest, you're looking at the West Coast, that is all over. You talk about up there in the Northeast above Buffalo, so that's quite a journeyman, and not in a negative way. We talk about journeyman, sometimes people think enhancement guys, things of that nature. Wilbur Snyder was the top guy, and so that's a lot of traveling to do, especially dragging the kids around, but he made it work. He was a top star. So, Steve, I'm going to ask you the same question. You did that early digging, so what surprised you? You probably got a few surprises on your end, but what surprised you most about Wilbur Snyder?
Well, there are a lot of things. I'll mention a few small details first. Richard mentioned Wilbur living in Ontario. It's kind of interesting to me that Wilbur lived in the same small beach community as Kiniski and Don Leo Jonathan. I don't know how many wrestlers were staying there, but, those three had, I think, a pretty strong friendship. The families were close. Also, I didn't realize, I grew up watching wrestling, and we got wrestling from Indianapolis on one of the Detroit channels. I was familiar with Wilbur Snyder, but, I had no idea until I started working, when I was working on the Kiniski book, that absolutely Snyder was one of the top 5 wrestlers in the United States for about a 10-year period. I saw him wrestle on TV when he was in his 40s. He was good, but I didn't realize what an impact he'd made in earlier times. But another small detail brought up by Mike Snyder is that his dad loved to play the bad guy when he had the chance in Japan.
Oh, okay.
People don't usually associate Wilbur Snyder with cheating or being sneaky, though some audiences saw it that way when he was fighting Vern Gagne in certain markets.
Sure.
But I think what surprised me most was Wilbur's devotion to his family in an era where that was pretty rare among wrestlers. He did all that traveling, Wilbur mentioned, for his family. He wanted to, build up that nest egg, to settle down with his family. And ultimately, he did that. So I just found him to be a very respectable, decent guy. And I think what surprised me was the degree to which I determined that's exactly what he was.
Yeah, Richard mentioned sometimes the wrestlers of that era specifically would move to the territory and leave their family behind X amount of months sometimes if they plan on coming back or things of that, or maybe just because, if you know what I mean. But then you see some that brought their family with them, but to see as much traveling as Wilbur did and to keep his family on the go like that, to continue to come home and see his children and his wife at the end of the day, That's very, admirable. Absolutely. During that time period, it sounds like he was a true baby face, but I can imagine it's nice to come out of your shell over there in Japan every once in a blue moon and get to play the heel like that. So I wish we had some footage of that. I'm going to have to go look and see what I have laying around. That you got me intrigued now. I never really thought of it that way. But so we talked about some surprises that as you guys were doing your research. So now let's talk about some of the fun stuff. Let's talk about the in-ring stuff. So as you guys were writing this book, and I'm going to ask both of you guys the same question again. And we'll start with Richard again here. What was maybe your favorite moment of Wilbur Snyder in the ring? Favorite match you got to write about or discuss, or favorite angle, or anything of that nature? Just something kayfabe, wrestling related, something that went on in the ring that you were excited to kind of talk about there in the book.
Well, actually, the match that stood out in my research, and I was aware of this before, was in August of 1956 at County Stadium in Milwaukee. There was a big card at the ballpark, home of the Milwaukee Braves at the time. There were features about this card with pictures in Wrestling Life magazine. The main event was Gagne versus Wilbur with referee Jack Dempsey, the boxing champion.
Right.
The other main event had Bruiser and Hans Schmidt against Reggie and Stan Lisowski. Years later, Reggie Lisowski would adopt the ring name The Crusher.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, if you were at that card, who would have thought that those guys would be in main events in the Midwest for the next 20 years?
Forever,
and
right.
Dominate cards in Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, all of that. That's I know that wasn't in my part of the book.
No, but you get to pick your favorite part of the book, though. It's okay, Richard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Steve, did he steal your pick?
Well, yeah, anything involving Gagne and Snyder was right up there.
Right.
Also, I enjoyed watching some meetings between Snyder and Angelo Poffo, a guy who I think is vastly underrated to present-day fans, if they remember him at all. I guess if you mention Macho Man, you may make the connection. I mean, but, the matches that most intrigue me are matches that do not survive. I'm talking about the early Snyder matches against Lou Thez, who, those matches really put Wilbur on the map nationally. They set him up for a great career. I mean, he certainly had Thez's respect. Not too many guys went to as many 60-minute draws with Thez as Wilbur Snyder did during that era. I wish more footage, from those early days survived. I like, some of what does survive from Hollywood wrestling in the 50s. But, I would say in terms of what survives, to me, it's the Gagne and Poffo matches that seem most compelling.
Okay, very, very fair. And I've seen Vern, there's a lot of hits and misses throughout wrestling history with a lot of guys' careers, but Vern always was a pretty solid worker, even to the 1970s. So I can only imagine back in their primes, Vern's prime, Wilbur's prime, what they were doing, because they were still capable of having decent matches much later in their careers, especially Vern. Yeah, that's that would be probably the main match for me, would be something with Vern Gagne out there. And like you said, Steve, going the limit with thosguys, doing the Broadways or near Broadways with guys like Thez and Vern Gagne. So that's just a different era. And Wilbur Snyder was part of that era, and he got to evolve. And Richard, we've talked about this in the past. And Wilbur becomes part of the Chicago wrestling scene as a promoter. Kayfabe, we're not supposed to admit that the wrestlers were the promoters, but that was the way it was. Richard told everybody. He broke the internet when he did that. But but so, Steve, you ended, I'm sorry, where did you end? 63 was when you kind of passed the torch, the baton over to...
Yeah, well, pretty much up to the point where Snyder and Bruiser got in business together. Okay.
And so, Richard, we talked at length in the past, and hopefully for more episodes to come, too, about the Chicago wrestling world, Wilbur Snyder, Dick the Bruiser, and everything in between. But do you guys recall what was Wilbur Snyder doing directly before he joined in with Bruiser and did the Chicago deal there. Where was he in the Chicago area at that point? Where was he coming from?
From around 1960 to 1964, Wilbur did not wrestle for Fred Kohler in Chicago. And Steve can chime in there. Wilbur was early on the ground floor during the formative years of the AWA. Mm-hmm. He was with the Roy Shire San Francisco promotion. He was in Indianapolis working for Jim Barnett and the booker Buck Estes. And of course, Jim Barnett, that included Cincinnati and Detroit also.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
It's interesting that, during those years prior to 64, Wilbur seemed to be, you could say, almost on a clock trying to find that place to settle down and give his son a chance to excel in high school sports and, not have to travel to the degree he used to. So, he did test a few new markets. He was huge in Northern California, and it seemed that maybe the move there would be permanent, from what I understand. But, I don't know what kind of communication might have gone on with Bruiser, but, Wilbur did return to Indianapolis, and that's where he decided to stay, and it worked out great. Yeah, Chicago was so it was an active few years, and he did keep the promise he made to his son that family would be settled down by that point, and that Mike wouldn't have to make new friends every 6 months or every year.
Yeah, Bruiser and Snyder were the existing tag team champions for Jim Barnett. But then all of a sudden, there were newspaper articles that announced someone with the last name Afflis, first initial L, had applied for a promoter's license in early 1964 in Indianapolis. L. Afflis is Louise Afflis, the wife of Dick the Bruiser. So they were stripped of the titles and then decided to form their own company, Championship Wrestling, Inc., to promote in Indianapolis. And they had 3 interesting principal owners and executives. The president was Louise Afflis, Bruiser's wife. The vice president was Shirley Snyder, Wilbur's wife. And the secretary-treasurer was Margaret Afflis Johnson, Bruiser's mom, who was a long-running politician in Indianapolis.
Oh, okay.
Which it always suggested, well, she would have helped him get on the right side of the State Athletic Commission. Anyway, they formed this company, ran cards opposite Jim Barnett. Eventually, Barnett left for Australia, and we have a new promotion in Indianapolis.
There we go. It's fun to see, they weren't the only wrestlers that did similar things like that. I was going back and doing some research on a few other territories where it was all in the family. Typically, a lot of the females getting named as the owners of these companies as well. And that's a lot, I don't know if people are aware, but I don't know if that was the case in this situation. It seems like it would be that wrestlers couldn't hold a wrestling license, and be the promoter of the same territory at the same time. And that's why they would do that. Even Ron Fuller had to do that, I believe, at some point. Maybe in Knoxville. I can't recall what it was I was doing some research on, but I've seen it happen time and time again, and usually that was because the state athletic commissions would not allow that. Is that right?
I've heard that multiple times since I started researching for a wrestling book. Yeah, like the Sheik's father-in-law, Francis Flesher.
Yes, that's right.
Was the president of Big Time Wrestling.
Yeah, and there were some guys who were secret partners in the promotion, too. I mean, Kiniski would be in that category.
Yeah.
I had no idea that even while he was defending the NWA title, he was a co-owner in Vancouver.
Relive the glory days of Memphis wrestling with the Retro Wrestling Review USWA podcast. Each week, we go back in time to review USWA Championship Wrestling from the 1990s, episode by episode. Join us for watch-alongs, behind-the-scenes stories, and exclusive interviews with people who were there and lived it. Whether you grew up watching it or you're discovering it for the first time, this podcast is your ringside seat to Memphis wrestling history. It's all a part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Listen now at uswapodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here. Lots of new stuff happening here at WrestleCopia. If you haven't checked out our website at WrestleCopia.com, it's a great way to keep up with the latest episodes of all of your favorite Copia programming, from the Wrestling Memory Grenade to Regional Rasslin with the Territory Talk, the Wrestling Stoop with the legendary Bob Roop, and of course all of those programs also available at your favorite podcast streaming platforms. And if you want to stay up to date with everything going on in the Copia world, all the latest news, random thoughts, fun videos, pictures, and more, make sure to join the more than 33,000 followers over at facebook.com/WrestlingGrenade. Don't be left out. Would also greatly appreciate you leaving us a 5-star review at your favorite podcast apps, guys, because every positive review makes our podcast more visible in the algorithms, if you will, which allows us to continue to grow. And last but definitely not least, it's what keeps the entire machine going. I'm talking about patreon.com/WrestleCopia. We appreciate your support in helping us pay the bills to keep the WrestleCopia Podcast Network running and enabling us to continue to bring you all the quality programming that we offer.
Hey, it's Bob Smith, and guess what? The Outdated Wrestling Hour is now part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. But hey, no fear, you're still going to hear the unique guests, comedy, music, authors, journalists, funny people. Who knows who's going to end up on the Outdated Wrestling Hour? Remember, it's all new and all old. So check it out in the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and wherever you get your podcasts. Listen if you know what's good for you.
So I was looking at an overview here, and I don't want to put you guys on the spot because maybe you don't have all of this memorized. He did have Wilbur had a hell of a long career going for him here, but I see in the notes, the career highlights, that it notes that Snyder toured Japan in 3 different years. Was he just there for those 3, on those 3 occasions, those 3 tours of Japan? Because if I'm looking at this, 66 and 69 would put him in the JWA, I believe. And 73, what would that be? Maybe IW. Could have been anybody at that point. New Japan, All Japan, IWE. Does anybody remember which promotions they worked for over there?
I don't want to misstate.
No, that's fine.
If this helps, the second tour, there was a recurring tag team where Snyder teamed with Danny Hodge against Inoki and Baba.
Oh, wow. So that would have been the end of the JWA, yes. Basically. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Wow. That would have been some fun matches.
He had 5 or 6 in 1966. It was 5 or 6 weeks wrestling almost every night. He left there. His first match back was the amphitheater, teaming with Moose Cholak.
All right.
So that's how I'm remembering JWA.
That's a different world, coming back from working Inoki and Baba back to Moose Cholak on your side there.
Yeah.
Welcome back to America, Wilbur. That's very cool. No, I was just curious. We have a Japanese podcast on the network that we do the history of. We started in the 1880s and we're up to 1964. Ricky Dozan's just been murdered, so we haven't gotten to 66 yet, or 69. So I was just kind of curious moving into those years. Now I get to look forward to some Wilbur Snyder coming through as we continue our research with that. But no, man, that's still fun stuff to see that Wilbur's traveling not just the United States, but he's leaving, Chicago and that area as well, and moving and doing some tours over in Japan. But he's always coming back home, and he's coming back to, well, they made quite a bit of money, as we talked about in the past, Richard, in the territories there for quite a long period of time, up until at least till the late 70s, when things started getting a little questionable. But wrestling fans, they love the behind-the-scenes stories. As much as we like to hear about, what went on in the ring, they love hearing gossip. And Wilbur Snyder didn't really have a whole lot of gossip going on for him. A pretty straight-laced guy for the most part. I mean, who did he play for? The Chargers, the Rams? I can't remember now off the top of my head.
Well, he did not make the Rams. He came very, very close. He was the last player cut. Wilbur had a pretty good college football career, but he left after 2 years. He was married. He had a son. He went back to California. He drove a cement truck for a while. Then he went to Canada to play football. But before he did leave for Edmonton, he tried out for the Rams. And even though he'd been out of football, at least organized football, for a couple of years, he came very, very, very close to making the team. But he did well in Canada after that.
I remember reading something about the Rams, so I got that much of it right anyway. So, well,
I just want to chime in.
Yeah.
Wilbur played on the Los Angeles Rams in the annual college all-star game, which used to happen for decades, where the NFL champion would play an all-star team of college graduates.
Okay.
This was held at Soldier Field every year, a big game that went up until the 1970s.
All
and he
right.
was on the Ram roster that night.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, for some reason, it appears he didn't actually play in the game, though, but he was cut shortly after that. But again, he came so close. That was near the end of the preseason, and he was still there. And, who knows? He still might have chosen wrestling because of the pay factor.
I was going to say,
still not making a great deal at that time.
Right, that's what I was thinking. Back then, it was better to be a pro wrestler on top, per se, than a football player back. It's amazing how times have changed, but that's the way things were back in that time period. So we talked a little bit about some of the things you guys learned as you were doing the research. So now I'm going to ask you, what is something that you guys enjoyed putting in the book that you thought the fans might get a kick off, something you figured nobody would know, and you put it in there specifically to kind of, I don't want to say shock the fans, but really just bring it to the light of day. Just something interesting about Wilbur Snyder, his life in the ring, out of the ring, anything in between.
I included several payoff schedules for big cards in Chicago. At the amphitheater or White Sox Park, where Wilbur was almost always at the top of the pay scale. He got some kudos or some extra moolah because he was also co-owner. He may have been in a main event. His opponent would get maybe 2/3 of what Wilbur got. But then again, Wilbur was an owner.
Yeah.
In fact, those three guys, Gagne, Snyder, and Bruiser, had a deal where they would still get a payment, even though they weren't on the card that night. Let's use an example. I can give a quick example. August 3rd, 1974, the main event in Chicago was Dick the Bruiser versus Ray Stevens. I think Bruiser got $6,000.
Okay.
Wilbur, who was wrestling somewhere else, and Vern, who were wrestling somewhere else, still got $1,500 each. And the legendary example of that is Gorilla Monsoon. Because when he sold his shares to Vince Jr., he got a deal where he would get preliminary money on every WWF card that was staged. There was some payoff stuff. So I thought if I could find stuff with Wilbur and payoffs.
Right. To give everybody an idea of what it's like to be a promoter and a wrestler on top like that. So, yeah, of course, he deservedly gets paid that $1,500 because he's co-promoter. He's getting his share back and he's working, like you said, in another town somewhere else. But that's the way it be. That's why these guys were promoting, I guess, at the time. I don't know why he wasn't giving it to his wife or whomever was actually on that paper, but that's another story, I suppose, for another day. So, Steve, I'm going to ask you the same question. Was there something you really enjoyed putting in the book that you felt like fans may not know and you wanted to make sure it got out there?
Well, in this day and age, I'm not sure my answer applies so much. But, when I grew up, Baron von Raschke was just a horrid person. I remember seeing him once at a spot show somewhere in Ontario. And, he was sitting down and, I didn't want to go near him. I was very young at that time. He played his character very well. So, when we thought about, who might be a good person to do the foreword to the book, Baron von Raschke came to mind. I had talked to him a couple of times, but I didn't realize until I talked to him concerning Wilbur Snyder that he had just a profound respect for Wilbur Snyder. I mean, I still am not used to hearing Baron von Raschke speak perfect Midwestern English, but, he's he's a nice guy, and he talked about Wilbur Snyder in very glowing terms. So I think some people who perhaps haven't followed wrestling for the past number of years may say, oh, Baron von Raschke, okay, he wrote the foreword. Wait a minute. This is normal English. He's not putting Wilbur Snyder down. So, that comes to mind. And also, Ray, I cheated a couple of minutes ago, and I looked up Snyder's last tour of Japan.
Okay.
Yeah, the JWA. Baba left the JWA in 1972.
Correct.
All Japan started shortly after that.
Right, at the end of 1972.
Final tour, when he won the tag team title, Danny Hodge, was for All Japan Pro Wrestling.
Okay, very good. I like that. See, that's what Google's for, guys. That's what it's all about. It's okay. So, no, that's great. Was there anything in the book that you guys simply, you left out? I don't know if it was because, you ran out of room, you didn't want to, couldn't cram everything you wanted to get. Is there anything either one of you wants to put out there right now on this podcast that maybe didn't make the book, that you thought, man, I wish we just had a couple more pages to get this in there?
I wish we could have had room for more photographs.
Okay.
Because there's some top photographers, Rick Johnson of Indianapolis and Scott Roomer of Indianapolis. None of their pictures, of course, I probably went overboard submitting hundreds of pictures. But, we understand that. You have so many pages, and you don't know the page count until Scott Teal starts the layout process.
Right.
So it's, there's still 150 plus illustrations in there.
Oh, yeah.
Because they intertwine the pictures on each text page.
Yeah, and I think anything we really thought should be in there, we made a point of making sure was in there. There were some details that we took out, but I think we made a point of leaving in everything that we figured ought to be there.
All right, if fans could take away one thing from Wilbur Snyder, what do you want? What was the goal when you, not just to tell the story of Wilbur Snyder, but what was the one thing you wanted the readers to come out with thinking about Wilbur Snyder? What were you trying to get across here on the legend of Wilbur Snyder?
Well, for me, I think it's interesting to what degree, he and, in fact, his family before him reflected so much of what was going on in the country. I mean, the movement west, the settlement in Utah, as far as his father is concerned in Santa Monica, just, the situation during the Depression, just by looking at the life of Wilbur Snyder, the role of TV during that era. There's just so much in his life that ties into so many things that were going on. I mean, we didn't just look at him as a wrestler and separate that life from everything else. I think it's interesting to see Wilbur in the context of a lot of other things that were going on during his lifetime.
The main thing I think they should remember about Wilbur is what highly respected promotions he ran. 18 years in Indianapolis with Bruiser, 17 years with Bruiser and Gagne in Chicago. In Indianapolis, Bruiser and Snyder first hired Bobby Heenan and David McLean into the industry.
Yes.
And they created, under their watch, the teams of the Blackjacks and the Valiant Brothers.
Yeah, that's some legendary tag teams. They both go on up to New York, win the tag titles throughout the 1970s, and Bobby Heenan obviously would become a huge star for Vern, and then later the WWF, the WWE. I mean, and rightfully so. Bobby would have got over anywhere. I mean, it was just a matter of fact. We've talked about that in the past, Richard, Bobby Heenan, but yeah, it's amazing that they were part of that too. It wasn't just, we ran a promotion. It was Chicago or it was Indianapolis and et cetera. We were part of the movement there, the territories up in that area, but they got to start for a lot of these guys, these talents that would go on to be huge stars in the 70s, the 80s, and beyond. And do people always think about Dick the Bruiser because Bobby Heenan loved to tell stories about Dick the Bruiser, but Wilbur Snyder was in on that too.
Yeah, and people often say that Wilbur Snyder was great for 10 years, and then what happened? They talk about him as somebody whose career fell short. But, if you look at what he accomplished from 1964 on until wrestling completely started to change in the 1980s, but, for a solid 15-year period in promotion, Wilbur did nothing to degrade his legacy. In fact, he built a legacy that few people in wrestling come close to matching, during that era or probably any other era. I mean, it was just an amazing career.
Sounds good to me. So before we wrap it up, we're going to talk all about where everybody can find the book. I got one question for each of you. We're going to start with you, Richard, because we've talked a little bit about the book you put out with Dick the Bruiser in the past. And I know it took a lot of time and a lot of research. This Wilbur Snyder book, since you had a co-author here, you cheated a little bit. You didn't have to do all of the research, but at the same point, I'm curious, you had to go into it, I'm assuming, with a similar mindset, even though you were only tackling half of Wilbur's career. What was the time frame? I'm not asking you how long it took necessarily, but just did it feel like you had to go through the same hoops you did to write the Snyder book that you did the Bruiser book?
It was a similar timeline. I want to acknowledge Tim Tassler of Fort Wayne, Indiana, who helps us and helped me on the Bruiser book with newspaper archive research.
Okay.
So that he's like an unsung hero here, but it helped me. It was doing a lot of the same time span as what I did for Bruiser. But of course it was for what did Wilbur do during that time?
Right.
So that was not too stressful.
Well, it's always good to get a little help. In fact, you got a lot of help. You guys helped each other here, and I love that it came together and you guys were able to put out something so definitive on a legend like Wilbur Snyder, because easily, you have to say, I would imagine you'll both agree with this, Wilbur Snyder, one of the most underrated figures in wrestling history, yes?
I say so.
Well, yes. I mean, again, people recognize that 10 years of brilliance in the ring, but they forget the other stuff.
The promoter, he continued to work throughout that time. Maybe he wasn't flashy. And Richard would talk about this a lot, too, with me when we were talking Chicago. He didn't care where he was on the card. He was selfless. He was like, I'll work wherever you need me. I'll put on a high flyer pair of tights tonight. Right, Richard? We were talking about that in the past.
Yes, I remember that. That was the 1976 White Sox Park. He was a high flyer for the night.
They had trouble getting Bruiser to agree to job all the way to the end of his career, but Wilbur said, just plug me in wherever you need me. He was a team player on top of being a promoter, so I think that's maybe why he gets lost in the shuffle as well. He wasn't forcing himself into the main event every night.
No, he was okay with putting somebody over to set up a match with Gagne or a Bruiser.
Right.
But then Wilbur on his own was, I think, a 14-time tag team co-holder in Indianapolis with many people.
Well, that's a jack of all trades there when you can do it with many different people and the fans are buying into it. And clearly they were for it to work for as many years as it did there. Steve, I got a question for you before we get into the purchasing of the book, all the information on the book, and then a couple other things I want to bring up with you guys. But you've written books outside of pro wrestling too, has Steve here, guys. And I got to ask you, does your process dealing with a professional wrestler or a professional wrestling book differ from the way you go about writing some of your other works?
Not much. I mean, a book that I was juggling while working on this project with Richard is something I co-wrote with a couple of friends from my hometown, and it is based on our hometown and how things have changed there over the years and what those changes mean. And all of that. And, the process is it's very similar. I mean, I like to take the historical approach. I don't think I would probably write a book on wrestling in the present era unless I had an angle that interested me. So, I just try to dig up those pieces and put them together and explain them. And, I don't feel there's a lot of difference. Some people say, well, a wrestling book is not really a book. Well, it is if you do it right, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of people just throw these books out there hoping to do a little cash grab sometimes. And, you guys really do your homework on anything you put out. I love the Pacific Northwest book. I'm a huge fan of the territories, studying the territories. Like I said, we've been doing Japan from the beginning, right? The origins, if you will. So I love going back and learning it from the earliest form you can find anyway. It's not a lot of internet back in the 1800s, guys, but we do our best and stuff. So, but you guys teased it at the beginning of the show. There may be another book in the works down the line, perhaps co-authoring between you two. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that might be should it ever happen. But we are right now talking about Wilbur Snyder, the world's most scientific wrestler. And I want you guys to please share with everyone how they can find this book and where they can purchase it at today.
Well, right now, the best option is to go to crowbarpress.com, and you will see the Wilbur Snyder book and a lot of other books well worth reading.
Okay, let's go to crowbarpress.com, guys. Scott Teal does amazing work. He's put out so many great books with the help of authors and great backstories, biographies. Anything at Crowbar Press is totally worth the price. So I say go pick it up myself. So that's what I did, and hopefully you guys will as well. I want to thank you guys for taking the time out, taking an hour out of your night here to spend here on Regional Rasslin. Richard, it's always great to talk with you, and we'll be back with more Chicago, I hope, around the corner. Steve, you're welcome back anytime, too. Whatever you want to talk about, you're a historian. I'd love to talk about the Pacific Northwest. We'd love to have you back on anytime. I want to thank you guys so very much for doing this with us here on Regional Rasslin on the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. I want to invite you guys back, like I said, anytime, talk about whatever you feel like. And if that next book ever happens, you guys are back here for that as well.
Much appreciated.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.